I took a deep breath, trying to regain some composure. My neighbors were definitely listening now, and I didn't want to give them any more of a show than I already had. Why? I asked quietly. Why did you blame me for Mom's death? She died of cancer. How was that my fault? Richard was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Because she spent all her time taking care of you instead of taking care of herself. Because she was so worried about how her death would affect you that she didn't fight hard enough to stay alive. The admission hit me like a slap. I'd wondered for years why he'd turned on me so completely after Mom died, but I'd never imagined it was because of something so fundamentally unfair. That's not how cancer works, I said. Tears streaming down my face now. Mom didn't die because she loved me too much. She died because she was sick. Because sometimes terrible things happen to good people for no reason at all. I know that now, he said quietly. I've known it for years. But by the time I realized how wrong I'd been, it was too late. You were gone, and Helen made it very clear that you never wanted to see me again. Helen was right. I didn't. And now? I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. Now you're here because you need something from me. Not because you miss me. Not because you're sorry. Not because you want to make things right. You're here because Helen left me money that you think you deserve. The money doesn't matter. Don't lie to me, I interrupted. If the money didn't matter, you wouldn't be here. You would have continued pretending I didn't exist, just like you have for the past 12 years. Richard was quiet again, and in that silence, I saw the truth. He was desperate. Desperate enough to swallow his pride and face the daughter he'd abandoned. Desperate enough to ask for forgiveness he didn't deserve in hopes of getting money he felt entitled to. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Hope flickered in his eyes. We spend time together. Get to know each other again. Show the lawyers that we've reconciled. That we have a real relationship. Fake a relationship, you mean? It doesn't have to be fake. We could really try to rebuild— No, I said firmly. If I agree to this, and I'm not saying I will, it would be a business arrangement. Nothing more. You want access to Helen's money, and I want— I paused, thinking. What did I want from this man who had hurt me so deeply? What do you want? He asked. Answers, I said finally. The truth about everything. About why you really kicked me out. About what happened in the months after I left. About why you never tried to contact me even once in 12 years. And if I give you the truth, then maybe we can pretend to be a happy family long enough to satisfy Helen's lawyers. Richard nodded slowly. When do we start? I looked at this man who had once been my father, who had broken my heart and abandoned me when I needed him most. The man who was now asking me to help him, to save him from the consequences of his own poor choices. Tomorrow, I said. Come back tomorrow at noon. And Richard, yes? Don't expect forgiveness. Don't expect love. Don't expect anything from me except the bare minimum required to meet Helen's conditions. Because that's all you're getting. He nodded again, looking relieved despite my harsh words. Thank you, Amber. You don't know what this means to me. You're right, I said. I don't. I closed the door and slid the chain lock back into place, then leaned against it, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me up. Helen was gone. The woman who had been my anchor, my safe harbor, my chosen family, was gone. And the man who had thrown me away 12 years ago was back, asking me to pretend we were a family so he could access the fortune she'd left me. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the floor, my head in my hands. What had Helen been thinking? Did she really believe that forcing Richard and me together would heal the wounds he'd inflicted? Did she think money was enough incentive for me to open my heart to the man who had broken it so completely? My phone buzzed with a text message. I pulled it out of my pocket and saw it was from my best friend Sarah. How was your day? Still on for dinner tonight? I stared at the message for a long moment. How could I even begin to explain what had just happened? How could I tell her that my aunt was dead, that I'd inherited $12 million, and that my estranged father wanted to reconcile so he could get his hands on the money? I typed back. Something came up. Rain check? Everything okay? Not really. I'll call you later. I put the phone aside and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I would have to face Richard Morrison again. Tomorrow, I would have to pretend that the past 12 years hadn't happened, that his abandonment hadn't shaped every relationship I'd had since, that his rejection hadn't left scars that still ached on quiet nights like this one. But tonight, I needed to grieve. For Helen, who had saved me and loved me and believed that everyone deserved a second chance, even the people who had hurt us most. For the father-daughter relationship that had died along with my mother 12 years ago. And for the girl I'd been before I learned that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally could walk away without looking back. The money didn't feel real yet. $12 million was just a number, too big to comprehend. But Helen's death felt real. The hole in my heart where she used to be felt real. And the fear of letting Richard back into my life, even temporarily, felt real too. What if he hurt me again? What if this was all just another elaborate way for him to break my heart? What if I went through with this charade, and at the end, I was still the abandoned 15-year-old girl crying on Helen's doorstep? But what if Helen had been right? What if there was something worth salvaging in the ruins of our relationship? What if Richard had really changed, really regretted his choices? I shook my head, pushing that dangerous thought away. Hope was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not when it came to Richard Morrison. I'd learned that lesson the hard way 12 years ago. Tomorrow, I would face my father. But I would do it with my armor on, my walls up, and my heart safely locked away. He wanted a reconciliation? I'd give him the performance of a lifetime. But he would never, ever get close enough to hurt me again. The money was mine. Helen had made sure of that. And if playing happy family was the price I had to pay for it, then that's what I'd do. But Richard would learn, just as I had learned all those years ago, that some things, once broken, can never truly be repaired. I had 12 million reasons to find out just how good an actress I could be. I took a deep breath, trying to regain some composure. My neighbors were definitely listening now, and I didn't want to give them any more of a show than I already had. Why? I asked quietly. Why did you blame me for Mom's death? She died of cancer. How was that my fault? Richard was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Because she spent all her time taking care of you instead of taking care of herself. Because she was so worried about how her death would affect you that she didn't fight hard enough to stay alive. The admission hit me like a slap. I'd wondered for years why he'd turned on me so completely after Mom died, but I'd never imagined it was because of something so fundamentally unfair. That's not how cancer works, I said, tears streaming down my face now. Mom didn't die because she loved me too much. She died because she was sick. Because sometimes terrible things happen to good people for no reason at all. I know that now, he said quietly. I've known it for years. But by the time I realized how wrong I'd been, it was too late. You were gone, and Helen made it very clear that you never wanted to see me again. Helen was right. I didn't. And now? I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. Now you're here because you need something from me. Not because you miss me. Not because you're sorry. Not because you want to make things right. You're here because Helen left me money that you think you deserve. The money doesn't matter. Don't lie to me, I interrupted. If the money didn't matter, you wouldn't be here. You would have continued pretending I didn't exist, just like you have for the past 12 years. Richard was quiet again, and in that silence, I saw the truth. He was desperate. Desperate enough to swallow his pride and face the daughter he'd abandoned. Desperate enough to ask for forgiveness he didn't deserve in hopes of getting money he felt entitled to. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Hope flickered in his eyes. We spend time together. Get to know each other again. Show the lawyers that we've reconciled. That we have a real relationship. Fake a relationship, you mean? It doesn't have to be fake. We could really try to rebuild— No, I said firmly. If I agree to this, and I'm not saying I will, it would be a business arrangement. Nothing more. You want access to Helen's money, and I want— I paused, thinking. What did I want from this man who had hurt me so deeply? What do you want? He asked. Answers, I said finally. The truth about everything. About why you really kicked me out. About what happened in the months after I left. About why you never tried to contact me even once in 12 years. And if I give you the truth, then maybe we can pretend to be a happy family long enough to satisfy Helen's lawyers. Richard nodded slowly. When do we start? I looked at this man who had once been my father, who had broken my heart and abandoned me when I needed him most. The man who was now asking me to help him, to save him from the consequences of his own poor choices. Tomorrow, I said. Come back tomorrow at noon. And Richard, yes? Don't expect forgiveness. Don't expect love. Don't expect anything from me except the bare minimum required to meet Helen's conditions. Because that's all you're getting. He nodded again, looking relieved despite my harsh words. Thank you, Amber. You don't know what this means to me. You're right, I said. I don't. I closed the door and slid the chain lock back into place, then leaned against it, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me up. Helen was gone. The woman who had been my anchor, my safe harbor, my chosen family, was gone. And the man who had thrown me away 12 years ago was back, asking me to pretend we were a family so he could access the fortune she'd left me. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the floor, my head in my hands. What had Helen been thinking? Did she really believe that forcing Richard and me together would heal the wounds he'd inflicted? Did she think money was enough incentive for me to open my heart to the man who had broken it so completely? My phone buzzed with a text message. I pulled it out of my pocket and saw it was from my best friend Sarah. How was your day? Still on for dinner tonight? I stared at the message for a long moment. How could I even begin to explain what had just happened? How could I tell her that my aunt was dead, that I'd inherited $12 million, and that my estranged father wanted to reconcile so he could get his hands on the money? I typed back. Something came up. Rain check? Everything okay? Not really. I'll call you later. I put the phone aside and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I would have to face Richard Morrison again. Tomorrow, I would have to pretend that the past 12 years hadn't happened, that his abandonment hadn't shaped every relationship I'd had since, that his rejection hadn't left scars that still ached on quiet nights like this one. But tonight, I needed to grieve. For Helen, who had saved me and loved me and believed that everyone deserved a second chance, even the people who had hurt us most. For the father-daughter relationship that had died along with my mother 12 years ago. And for the girl I'd been before I learned that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally could walk away without looking back. The money didn't feel real yet. $12 million was just a number, too big to comprehend. But Helen's death felt real. The hole in my heart where she used to be felt real. And the fear of letting Richard back into my life, even temporarily, felt real too. What if he hurt me again? What if this was all just another elaborate way for him to break my heart? What if I went through with this charade, and at the end, I was still the abandoned 15-year-old girl crying on Helen's doorstep? But what if Helen had been right? What if there was something worth salvaging in the ruins of our relationship? What if Richard had really changed, really regretted his choices? I shook my head, pushing that dangerous thought away. Hope was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not when it came to Richard Morrison. I'd learned that lesson the hard way 12 years ago. Tomorrow, I would face my father. But I would do it with my armor on, my walls up, and my heart safely locked away. He wanted a reconciliation? I'd give him the performance of a lifetime. But he would never, ever get close enough to hurt me again. The money was mine. Helen had made sure of that. And if playing happy family was the price I had to pay for it, then that's what I'd do. But Richard would learn, just as I had learned all those years ago, that some things, once broken, can never truly be repaired. I had 12 million reasons to find out just how good an actress I could be. The next morning, I woke up with puffy eyes and a headache that felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my skull. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought yesterday had been a nightmare. Then reality crashed back down on me like an avalanche. Helen was dead. My father was back, and I had agreed to the most emotionally dangerous thing I'd ever done in my adult life. I stumbled to the kitchen and made coffee with shaking hands. my mind racing with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. What had Richard's life been like these past 12 years? Had he ever regretted throwing me away? Had he ever wondered if I was okay? If I was alive? If I needed him? And why now? Why was he in financial trouble? Richard had always been smart with money, conservative with investments. What could have gone so wrong that he was facing bankruptcy? At 11:45 a.m., 15 minutes before our scheduled meeting, my doorbell rang again. I looked through the peephole and saw Richard standing there with a bouquet of white lilies, Mom's favorite flowers. The sight of them made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't name. I opened the door without the chain this time. We were doing this. We were really doing this. You're early, I said. I couldn't sleep, he admitted, holding out the flowers. These are for... I thought you might want to visit your mother's grave, together. The suggestion caught me off guard. I hadn't been to Mom's grave in over 3 years. It was too painful, too loaded with memories of the life we'd had before everything fell apart. Why would we do that? Because I need to apologize to her too, he said quietly. For what I did to you. For breaking the promise I made to her before she died. What promise? Richard's jaw tightened. That I would take care of you. That I would love you enough for both of us. The words hung between us like a confession. I wanted to be angry, to throw his broken promises back in his face. But there was something in his expression, genuine remorse maybe, or just exhaustion, that made me pause. Fine, I said finally. But we're taking my car. The drive to Oakwood Cemetery was silent except for the radio playing softly in the background. Richard sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing landscape. I could feel the weight of his presence, the awkwardness of sharing space with someone who had once been so familiar and was now essentially a stranger. Mom's grave was in the older section of the cemetery, under a massive oak tree that provided shade even in the middle of winter. The headstone was simple. Margaret Morrison, beloved wife and mother, 1975-2009. Someone, probably Helen, had been keeping it clean. Fresh flowers sat in the built-in vase, though they were starting to wilt. Richard knelt down and placed the lilies next to the existing arrangement. His hands were trembling slightly. I'm sorry, Maggie, he whispered, and his voice broke on her name. I'm so sorry for what I did to our baby girl. I know you would never forgive me if you knew. I watched him struggle with his emotions. This man who had always prided himself on being strong, controlled, unbreakable. Seeing him vulnerable like this should have felt satisfying. Instead, it just made me feel hollow. She knows, I said quietly. Richard looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. What? She knows what you did. And you're right, she would never forgive you for it. It was cruel, but I needed to say it. Needed him to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. Not just to me, but to Mom's memory. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. Amber, you promised her you'd take care of me, I continued. You promised her I'd be safe, that I'd be loved, that I'd never feel abandoned. And then 3 months after she died, you threw me out like garbage because it was easier than dealing with your own pain. I was drowning, he said, his voice barely audible. After she died, I couldn't function. Every time I looked at you, I saw her. Your smile, your laugh, the way you'd scrunch up your nose when you were thinking hard about something. You were so much like her, and it hurt so much I could barely breathe. So you got rid of me. I thought it would help. I thought if I didn't have to see you every day, if I didn't have to be reminded of what I'd lost. He shook his head. I was wrong. It made everything worse. I stared down at him, kneeling by my mother's grave, finally admitting what I'd suspected all along. He hadn't thrown me out because I was a burden, or because he blamed me for Mom's death, though those things were probably true too. He'd thrown me out because I reminded him too much of what he'd lost. When did you realize you'd made a mistake? I asked. About a week after you left, he admitted. I came home to an empty house and the silence was deafening. I kept expecting to hear your music playing upstairs, or the sound of you talking on the phone with your friends. I went to your room to... He paused, swallowing hard. To tell you dinner was ready, and then I remembered. You weren't there anymore. You were never going to be there anymore. So why didn't you come find me? I tried, he said, and something in his tone made me believe him. I drove around looking for you for days. I called your friends, your teachers, anyone I thought might know where you were. But you just disappeared. I was sleeping in my car in the Walmart parking lot. The admission hung between us like an accusation. Richard's face went white. What? For 3 weeks, I slept in the back seat of that little Honda you bought me for my 16th birthday. I used the bathroom at gas stations and showered at the 24-hour gym. I lived off vending machine food and whatever I could afford with the money from my part-time job. Richard looked like he was going to be sick. I didn't know. You didn't look hard enough. I called the police. They said you were old enough to make your own choices, that unless there was evidence of foul play. He trailed off, staring at the ground. I should have kept looking. I should have hired a private investigator. I should have done more. Yes, I agreed. You should have. We stood in silence for several minutes, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The wind rustled through the oak tree above us, and somewhere in the distance, a groundskeeper was mowing grass. Normal sounds of a normal day, while my world was quietly falling apart. What happened after I left? I asked finally. What did you do with yourself? Richard stood up slowly, brushing dirt off his knees. I worked, a lot. I threw myself into the business, took on more clients, worked longer hours, anything to avoid going home to that empty house. And I drank, he admitted. More than I should have. More than was healthy. Helen tried to stage an intervention about 6 months after you left, but I wasn't ready to hear what she had to say. What did she say? That I was a coward. That I had destroyed the one good thing left of Margaret's legacy. That you were the best part of both of us, and I'd thrown you away because I was too selfish to see past my own pain. Helen had never told me about any intervention. She'd never mentioned trying to get Richard to bring me home. But that was Helen, always protecting me from things that might hurt me, even when the truth might have been easier to bear than the questions. She was right, I said. I know. I've known for years. But by the time I got sober, by the time I was ready to admit what I'd done and try to make it right, Helen told me you didn't want to see me. That you'd specifically asked her never to give me information about your life. That was true. I had made Helen promise never to tell Richard where I was, what I was doing, how I was managing. I'd needed to know that I was truly free of him, that he couldn't hurt me again even if he wanted to. So you just gave up? What choice did I have? You were an adult by then. You'd made it clear you wanted nothing to do with me. I couldn't force you to forgive me. You could have tried. How? He asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. How do you apologize for something like that? How do you ask forgiveness from someone whose life you destroyed? You start with the truth, I said. All of it? No excuses, no justifications. Just the truth, Richard nodded slowly. What do you want to know? Everything. Start with why you're really in financial trouble. He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with shame. I made some bad investments about 5 years ago. A business partner convinced me to put everything into a development deal that seemed foolproof. Luxury condos on the waterfront, pre-sold units, guaranteed returns. Let me guess, it wasn't foolproof. The partner disappeared with most of the money. The development was never built. The buyers sued. I lost everything I'd invested, plus legal fees, plus damages. How much? $4 million. I stared at him. $4 million? Richard, how did you even have that much to lose? The business was more successful than you knew, he said. After you left, I worked nonstop. Morrison Construction became one of the biggest firms in the state. I was pulling in 7 figures a year by the time I made that investment. Morrison Construction. The company he'd built with Mom, the company that had paid for our house, my private school tuition, family vacations. The company that was now apparently on the verge of bankruptcy. So you lost everything? Not everything, but close. I mortgaged the house to try to keep the business afloat, took out loans against the company's assets. But it wasn't enough. The legal fees alone have been crushing. When do you have to pay? Richard looked at his watch. I have 60 days to come up with $3 million, or I lose the house and the business. Everything your mother and I built together will be gone. $3 million. Not even a quarter of Helen's inheritance. If I gave him the money, I'd still have $9 million left, more money than I could spend in a lifetime. But giving him the money meant forgiving him, and I wasn't sure forgiveness was something I was capable of. Is that why you really want to reconcile? I asked. Because you need my money to save yourself? Partly, he admitted, and I had to respect his honesty. But not entirely. Amber, these past 12 years, they've been hell. Not just because of the financial problems, but because I lost you. Because I knew that somewhere out there my daughter was living her life without me, and it was my own fault. Did you ever try to find out how I was doing? Through Helen or anyone else? Richard looked uncomfortable. Helen gave me updates sometimes, whether I asked for them or not. When you graduated high school early, when you got the scholarship to Northwestern, when you started your own business. She told you about my business? She was so proud of you, he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. She said you'd started a marketing consultancy, that you were working with small businesses to help them grow. She said you were brilliant at it, that you had a gift for understanding what people needed. I was surprised by how much it meant to me that he knew about my work, that he knew I'd made something of myself despite his abandonment. But I was also angry that Helen had been sharing my life with him when she'd promised to keep us separate. What else did she tell you? That you never married. That you'd had a few serious relationships, but nothing that lasted. That you lived alone, worked too much, and didn't trust easily. He paused. That last part was my fault. He wasn't wrong. My trust issues were legendary among my friends. I'd had 3 serious relationships in the past 12 years, and all of them had ended the same way, with me sabotaging things the moment my partner tried to get too close. I couldn't help it. Every time someone told me they loved me, all I could hear was my father's voice telling me I was worthless, that I was too much trouble, that I wasn't worth keeping. Did she tell you anything else? That you still had nightmares about the night I kicked you out? That you'd wake up screaming sometimes, thinking you were back in that car? I flinched. I hadn't had one of those nightmares in over a year, but they'd plagued me for most of my 20s. Dreams where I was 15 again, scared and alone, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. She shouldn't have told you that. Maybe not, but I'm glad she did. I needed to know what I'd done to you, what I was still doing to you, even years later. We started walking back toward the car, both of us lost in thought. The afternoon sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. It should have been peaceful, but I felt anything but calm. Can I ask you something? Richard said as we reached the car. You can ask. I might not answer. Why did you agree to this? To trying to reconcile? You could have just walked away from Helen's money, started fresh somewhere else. You didn't have to see me again. It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since yesterday. Why had I agreed to this charade? The money was life-changing, certainly, but I'd been doing fine on my own. My business was successful. I owned my apartment. I had savings. I didn't need Helen's inheritance to survive. Because she asked me to, I said finally. Not directly, but Helen never did anything without a reason. If she put that clause in her will, it's because she believed there was something worth saving between us. And do you believe that? I looked at this man who had once been my hero, who had once made me feel safe and loved and cherished. The man who had also broken my heart so completely that I wasn't sure all the pieces had ever been put back together properly. I don't know, I admitted, but I'm willing to find out. For Helen. Not for yourself? Definitely not for you. Richard nodded, accepting the boundary I was setting. Fair enough. So what now? What does reconciliation look like to you? I don't know yet, I said as we got in the car. But I have some ground rules. Okay. First, this is temporary. We do whatever we need to do to satisfy Helen's lawyers, and then we go back to our separate lives. Understood. Second, no lies. If I ask you a question, you tell me the truth, even if it makes you look bad. Agreed. Third, you don't get to be my father again. You gave up that right 12 years ago. We're two adults trying to solve a mutual problem. Nothing more. Richard was quiet for a moment, and I could see that the third rule had hit him harder than the first two. Good. He needed to understand that there were consequences for his choices, that some things couldn't be undone just because he was sorry now. What if, he started, then stopped. What if what? What if we find that we actually like each other? That we could have a real relationship? Then we'll deal with that when it happens, I said. But don't count on it. We drove back to my apartment in silence, both of us processing everything that had been said and revealed. When we pulled into my parking lot, Richard made no move to get out of the car. Amber? Yeah? I know I don't have the right to ask this, but are you happy? With your life, I mean. Are you happy? The question caught me off guard. Was I happy? I had a successful business, a nice apartment, good friends. I was financially stable, emotionally independent, professionally respected. By most measures, I was doing well, but happy? That was harder to answer. Happiness seemed like such a luxury, something for people who hadn't had their trust broken so fundamentally that they struggled to let anyone get close. I had moments of contentment, moments of satisfaction, moments of genuine joy. But lasting happiness? The kind that came from feeling truly connected to other people, truly safe in the world? I'm working on it, I said finally. Richard nodded, as if that was a better answer than he'd expected. Good, that's good. What about you? I found myself asking, though I wasn't sure why I cared. No, he said without hesitation. I haven't been happy since the day I made the worst decision of my life. Since the day I threw away the most important thing I had left. Your business? You, he said quietly. I threw away you. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back. I couldn't afford to be moved by his words, couldn't afford to let hope creep in. Hope was dangerous when it came to Richard Morrison. I'll call you tomorrow, I said instead. We need to figure out how to make this look real to Helen's lawyers. Okay. He got out of the car, then leaned down to look at me through the passenger window. Amber, thank you for giving me this chance. I know I don't deserve it. You don't, I agreed. But Helen thought you did. And I loved her enough to find out if she was right. He nodded and walked away, his shoulders slumped with the weight of everything we'd discussed. I sat in my car for a long time after he left, staring up at my apartment building, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. How are you holding up? Still want to talk about yesterday? I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. Can you come over? I need to tell you something. It's complicated. On my way. An hour later, Sarah was sitting on my couch with a bottle of wine and a box of tissues, listening to me explain the impossible situation I'd found myself in. She'd been my best friend for 8 years, ever since we'd met in a business networking group, and she was one of the few people who knew the full story of my relationship with my father. So let me get this straight, she said when I finished talking. Your aunt, who you loved like a mother, died and left you $12 million. But you can only get the money if you reconcile with the father who abandoned you. And he only wants to reconcile because he's broke and needs your money to save his business. That's the situation, yes. And you agreed to this why, exactly? It was the same question Richard had asked, and I still didn't have a good answer. Because Helen wanted me to. Because maybe she saw something I can't see, because... I trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. Because you still love him, Sarah said gently. No. The denial came out sharper than I intended. I don't love him. I can't love him. He made sure of that. Honey, love doesn't just disappear because someone hurts you. It goes underground, gets buried under anger and hurt and self-protection, but it doesn't disappear. I hate him, I said. But the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. I know you do, and you have every right to hate him. But that doesn't mean you don't still love him too. The idea that I might still love Richard Morrison, even after everything he'd done, was so terrifying I couldn't even consider it. Love made you vulnerable. Love gave people the power to destroy you. And Richard had already proven he was willing to use that power. It doesn't matter what I feel, I said. This is a business arrangement. I help him save his company, he helps me get Helen's money, and then we go back to pretending the other doesn't exist. And what if it's not that simple? What if spending time with him brings up feelings you're not prepared to deal with? Then I'll deal with them, I said. I'm not 15 anymore, Sarah. I'm not that scared, abandoned girl sleeping in her car. I'm stronger now, smarter. I won't let him hurt me again. Sarah looked at me with the expression she got when she thought I was being naive about something. Just be careful, okay? I've seen what happens when you let people get too close. You either push them away or they disappoint you. With your father, the stakes are so much higher. I know. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, this sounds like the most emotionally dangerous thing you could possibly do. You're essentially agreeing to pretend you have a relationship with the person who traumatized you most. That's not just risky, it's potentially devastating. She was right, of course. Sarah was always right about these things. But I'd already committed to this path, and backing out now felt like admitting defeat. Helen believed there was something worth saving, I said. I have to trust her judgment. Helen loved you, Sarah pointed out. Sometimes people who love us make decisions they think are in our best interests, even when those decisions might actually hurt us. Are you saying I shouldn't do this? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in her glass. I'm saying be honest about why you're really doing it. If you're doing it for Helen, fine. If you're doing it for the money, also fine. But if you're doing it because some part of you is hoping your father will finally become the man you needed him to be 12 years ago, that's when you're setting yourself up to get hurt all over again. After Sarah left, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her words echoing in my head. Was she right? Was I setting myself up for another devastating disappointment? Or was there really a chance that Richard had changed, that we could find some kind of peace together? I thought about the man I'd seen today, older, broken, full of regret. He seemed genuinely sorry for what he'd done, genuinely desperate to make things right. But then again, he was also facing bankruptcy and needed my money. How much of his remorse was real, and how much was just desperation? Only time would tell. And unfortunately, time was exactly what Helen's will was going to force us to spend together. I rolled over and closed my eyes, trying not to think about tomorrow, when this strange new chapter of my life would really begin. Trying not to think about what it would mean to let Richard Morrison back into my world, even temporarily. Trying not to think about the tiny, dangerous part of my heart that was already wondering if maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for us to find our way back to each other. But that was a thought too risky to entertain. Because if I was wrong, if he disappointed me again, if he proved that his apologies were just another way to use me, I wasn't sure I'd survive it. Some chances were worth taking, but this one might just destroy what was left of my ability to trust anyone, including myself. 3 weeks into our forced reconciliation, I was starting to think Helen had been certifiably insane when she wrote her will. Richard and I had been meeting twice a week, going through the motions of rebuilding a relationship that felt more like reconstructing a crime scene. We'd had lunch at neutral restaurants, taken walks in public parks, even attended a baseball game together, all carefully documented with photos and receipts that Helen's lawyers would eventually scrutinize. On the surface, it looked like progress. We were civil to each other. We made small talk about safe topics like the weather and current events. We smiled for the cameras and played our parts perfectly, but underneath, the tension was suffocating. Every conversation felt scripted. Every shared moment felt artificial. And worst of all, I was starting to realize that despite everything he'd put me through, despite all my walls and defenses, I still cared what happened to him. That realization hit me on a Thursday morning when Richard called to cancel our lunch meeting. I'm sorry, Amber, he said, and his voice sounded strange, strained. Something's come up at work. Can we reschedule for tomorrow? Sure, I said, but something in his tone made me hesitate. Richard? Are you okay? You sound… I'm fine, he said quickly. Too quickly. Just work stuff. I'll call you tomorrow. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone with a growing sense of unease. In the 3 weeks we'd been doing this dance, Richard had never canceled on me. He'd been almost obsessively punctual, as if he was afraid I'd change my mind if he gave me any excuse to walk away. I tried to focus on work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By lunchtime, my anxiety had reached a level that surprised me with its intensity. Why did I care if Richard was having a bad day? Why was his strange tone eating at me like this? Against my better judgment, I decided to drive by Morrison Construction's offices, just to see if everything looked normal. Just to put my mind at ease. The building was a modest 2-story structure in an industrial part of town, with Richard's company logo prominently displayed on a sign out front. I'd never been inside, had never wanted to see the business he'd built after throwing me away, but I'd driven by it once or twice over the years, usually by accident. Today, the parking lot was nearly empty except for Richard's car and a black sedan I didn't recognize. Through the large windows, I could see people moving around inside. Something about the scene made my stomach clench with worry. Before I could talk myself out of it, I parked and walked toward the building. The front door was unlocked, so I stepped inside. The lobby was small but professional, with framed photos of construction projects lining the walls. A receptionist's desk sat empty, and I could hear voices coming from what I assumed was Richard's office down the hall. Final notice, Mr. Morrison, we've been more than patient, but our clients are demanding action. I understand that, Richard's voice replied, and he sounded exhausted. But I told you I have the money. I just need 60 more days to access it. We don't have 60 days. The court order is final. If you can't produce the $3 million by next Friday, we'll have no choice but to begin asset seizure. My blood ran cold. Next Friday. Not 60 days, 7 days. I crept closer to the office, staying out of sight, but positioning myself where I could hear better. There has to be something else we can do, Richard was saying. Some kind of payment plan, an extension. Mr. Morrison, you've already had 2 extensions. Our clients have been generous, but their patience is exhausted. $3 million by Friday, or we start seizing assets. And if I can't get it, then you lose everything. The business, the house, your vehicles, your personal assets. Everything will be liquidated to pay the judgment. There was a long silence, and when Richard spoke again, his voice was barely audible. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing, I can do to change this timeline? I'm afraid not. I'm sorry, Richard. I really am. But the law is the law. I heard footsteps approaching the door and quickly retreated, slipping out of the building and back to my car. My heart was pounding as I sat there, processing what I'd just heard. Richard had lied to me. He didn't have 60 days to come up with the money. He had 7. 7 days to produce $3 million or lose everything he'd worked for since Mom died. Why had he lied? To avoid seeming desperate? To protect his pride? Or because he knew that if I understood how dire his situation really was, I might feel pressured to help him before we'd satisfied Helen's conditions? I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning with questions and emotions I didn't want to examine too closely. When I got to my apartment, I found Richard sitting on the steps outside my building, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard my car, and his face was a map of devastation. His eyes were red-rimmed, his suit wrinkled, his normally perfect posture slumped with defeat. "Amber," he said, standing up slowly. I need to tell you something." "I know," I said quietly. He blinked in surprise. "You know? I went by your office. I heard the lawyers talking to you." Richard's face went pale. "You were there? Why did you lie to me? About the timeline?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ground. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "Because I was ashamed," he said simply. "Because admitting that I only had a week left felt like admitting that I'd failed completely. That I'd lost everything your mother and I built together, and I couldn't even manage to hold on to it long enough to maybe, possibly, earn back a relationship with you. So you thought lying was better? I thought having a few more weeks to prove to you that I'd changed, that I was worth forgiving, might give us a real chance. I thought if you knew how desperate I really was, You'd think I was just using you, aren't you? The question hung between us like a blade. Richard flinched as if I'd struck him. At first, he admitted. When I first came to your door, yes. I was thinking about the money, about saving the business. But these past 3 weeks, what about them? I've remembered what it was like to have a daughter, he said, his voice breaking. I've remembered what I threw away, and it had nothing to do with money. Amber, these 3 weeks with you, even fake, even scripted, have been the best part of my life in 12 years. I stared at him. This man who had broken my heart and was now breaking, his own trying to fix what he'd destroyed. The lawyers said you have until Friday? Yes? That's 6 days. Yes. And if you don't come up with $3 million by then, I lose everything. The business, the house, all of it. I thought about Helen's inheritance. $12 million sitting in an account, waiting for me to jump through the hoops she'd set up. $3 million would be nothing, a quarter of the total, leaving me with more money than I could spend in a lifetime. But giving him the money would mean letting him back into my life permanently. It would mean taking a leap of faith that he'd truly changed, that he wouldn't hurt me again. It would mean risking everything I'd built to protect myself over the past 12 years. What do you want from me, Richard? I don't know, he said honestly. I mean, I know what I need from you. But what I want… He paused, struggling to find the words. I want my daughter back. I want to earn the right to be in your life again. I want to prove that I'm not the same man who threw you away 12 years ago. And if I can't give you that? If the best I can offer is helping you save your business and then walking away, then I'll be grateful for whatever you're willing to give, he said. Because even these fake lunches and forced conversations have meant more to me than you can possibly imagine. I looked at this broken man sitting on my steps, and for the first time since he'd showed up at my door, I saw past the businessman, past the father who had abandoned me, past the desperate person who needed my money. I saw someone who was genuinely sorry, genuinely changed, genuinely hoping for a second chance he didn't deserve but needed anyway. Come upstairs, I said finally. We need to talk. Richard followed me into my apartment, looking around with curiosity. It was the first time he'd been inside my space, and I watched him take in the framed photos, the books, the evidence of the life I'd built without him. You have a beautiful home, he said softly. Thank you. We sat on opposite ends of my couch, the distance between us feeling both too much and not nearly enough. I've been thinking about Helen's will, I said, about why she really put that clause in there. And I don't think it was about the money. I think she knew that we both needed something from each other, and money was just the vehicle to force us together long enough to figure out what that was. Richard nodded slowly. What do you think we need from each other? You need forgiveness, I said. And I need to know that I'm not unlovable. That what happened 12 years ago was about your grief and your mistakes, not about my worth as a person. Amber, Richard said, leaning forward urgently, you have to know that you were never, never unlovable. What I did had nothing to do with you and everything to do with my own failures. I know that intellectually, but knowing it and believing it are two different things. What would it take for you to believe it? I thought about the question seriously. What would it take for me to truly believe that I was worthy of love, that the people I cared about wouldn't abandon me when things got difficult? Time, I said finally. And proof. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but consistent, reliable proof that you're not going anywhere. Even when things get hard. And if I can't give you that proof, if the business fails and I have to start over somewhere else, then we'll figure it out. Together. The word slipped out before I could stop it. Together. As if we were a team. As if I'd already decided to trust him again. Richard's eyes widened with something that looked like hope. Together? I'm going to give you the money, I said, and saying it out loud made it real. Not because Helen's will forces me to, and not because I've forgiven you, not yet, but because I want to see who you are when you're not desperate. I want to see if the man I've gotten to know these past 3 weeks is real or just another performance. Amber, I can't ask you to, You're not asking. I'm offering. But I have conditions. Anything. First, no more lies. Ever. About anything. I don't care how small or embarrassing or complicated the truth is. If I ask you a question, you answer honestly. Done. Second, we do this slowly. I'm not ready to call you Dad again. I'm not ready to pretend that 12 years didn't happen. We're going to have to build whatever this is from the ground up. And it's going to take time. I understand. Third, if you hurt me again, if you disappoint me or abandon me or make me feel like I was wrong to trust you, that's it. There won't be another chance. I won't survive another betrayal from you. Richard was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing the weight of what I was saying. I was giving him everything he'd asked for and more, but I was also making it clear that the stakes couldn't be higher. I won't hurt you again, he said finally. I know you have no reason to believe that, but I swear to you on your mother's memory, I will never hurt you again. We'll see. I got up and went to my laptop, pulling up the bank account information Helen's lawyers had given me. $3 million would transfer instantly, would solve Richard's immediate crisis, would give us both the breathing room we needed to figure out what came next. But as my fingers hovered over the keyboard, I felt a moment of panic. What if Sarah was right? What if I was setting myself up for another devastating disappointment? What if this was all just another elaborate way for Richard to break my heart? Amber? Richard said softly. Are you having second thoughts? I turned to look at him. He was watching me with an expression I remembered from childhood. Patient, understanding, willing to wait for me to make my own decision in my own time. It was the expression he'd worn when I was learning to tie my shoes, when I was struggling with math homework, when I was too scared to ride my bike without training wheels. It was the expression of a father who loved his daughter. No, I said, turning back to the computer. No second thoughts. I typed in the transfer amount and Richard's account information. $3 million. The price of a second chance. The cost of hope. There, I said, hitting the enter key. It's done. Richard stared at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. When he looked up again, there were tears streaming down his face. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, I said. Thank me in a year, when we've figured out if this was the smartest thing I've ever done or the stupidest. It's the smartest, he said with conviction. I promise you, it's the smartest. Over the next few months, Richard proved that promise in small, consistent ways. He called when he said he would call. He showed up when he said he would show up. He answered my questions honestly, even when the truth was uncomfortable. We started having dinner once a week, then twice. We attended a cooking class together, went to a few movies, took a weekend trip to the mountains where Mom used to take me as a kid. Slowly, carefully, we began to build something new. It wasn't the relationship we'd had before Mom died. That innocence was gone forever. But it was real in a way that felt more solid than what we'd had before. It was built on truth instead of assumptions, on choice instead of obligation. 6 months after I transferred the money that saved his business, Richard asked if I wanted to spend Christmas together. Just us, he said. Like we used to when you were little before you threw me out? I finished and he flinched. I deserve that. Yes, you did, but... I paused, considering. Yes, I'd like that. I'd like to spend Christmas with you. Christmas morning. I woke up in the guest room of the house I'd grown up in. The house Richard had almost lost. The house that was now safe because of Helen's gift to both of us. He'd made coffee and pancakes, just like he used to when I was small. And we exchanged simple gifts and talked about Mom. It felt like coming home. I have something for you, Richard said, after we'd finished breakfast. He went to his desk and came back with a small wrapped box. Inside was a key. What's this for? The front door, he said quietly. I know you have your own place, your own life. But I wanted you to know that you always have a home here. That door will never be locked to you again. I held the key in my palm, this small piece of metal that represented so much more than access to a house. It represented belonging, safety, The knowledge that I would never again be homeless, never again be unwanted. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you," he said back, "for giving me a chance I didn't deserve, for being braver than I ever was, for becoming the incredible woman you are despite everything I put you through." "I'm not incredible," I said. "I'm just stubborn." "You're both," he said, smiling. "Just like your mother." That afternoon, we visited Mom's grave together. I placed fresh flowers on her headstone while Richard knelt beside me. "I think she would have approved," he said quietly. "Of what?" "Of us finding our way back to each other. Of you being strong enough to forgive me even when I didn't deserve it." "I haven't forgiven you yet," I said, but there was no anger in it anymore. Just honesty, I know. But maybe someday? I looked at this man who had once been my whole world, who had broken my heart, who had spent the past 6 months proving that people could change, that second chances were sometimes worth the risk. Maybe someday, I agreed. As we drove home in comfortable silence, I thought about Helen and the impossible gift she'd given us both. She'd known that we needed each other, not for money or convenience or obligation, but for healing. She'd known that I needed to learn that love didn't always end in abandonment, and Richard needed to learn that forgiveness was possible even for unforgivable mistakes. $12 million had bought us a second chance. But what we did with that chance, whether we built something real and lasting or let old wounds destroy us, that was up to us. So far, we were choosing to build. And for the first time in 12 years, I believed we might actually succeed. "Hey, Richard," I said as we pulled into his driveway. "Yeah? Next week, I want you to tell me about the darkest time in your life after I left. The whole truth, no matter how bad it was." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, are you sure you want to hear it?" "No," I admitted, "but I think I need to. And I think you need to tell it." "Okay," he said again. "Next week, because that's what we did now. We told each other the hard truths. We faced the difficult conversations. We chose transparency over comfort, healing over protection. It wasn't easy. Some days were better than others. Some conversations left us both raw and exhausted. But we kept showing up for each other, kept choosing to build something new from the ruins of what we'd lost. And slowly, carefully, we were becoming a family again. Not the family we'd been before. That was gone forever. But something new, something chosen, something real. Helen had been right. We had needed each other. And finally, we were brave enough to try. The doorbell rang again exactly 1 year later. But this time, I wasn't afraid to answer it. Richard stood on my doorstep holding a small wrapped box and wearing the nervous smile I'd learned meant he had something important to say. "What's the occasion?" I asked, stepping aside to let him in. "It's been exactly 1 year since I transferred the business ownership papers," he said. "Since we became real partners." That had been his idea. 6 months after I'd saved his company, he'd insisted on making me a 50% owner. "It's only fair," he'd said. "You saved it. You should own it." It had been another step in rebuilding trust, another way for him to show that his words had substance behind them. "And," I prompted, curious about the box, "and I wanted to give you this." Inside was a simple silver necklace with a small pendant, 2 interlocking hearts, one slightly larger than the other. "Richard," I started, but he held up his hand. "Before you say anything, let me explain. The larger heart represents the love I should have given you all along. The smaller one represents the love you've given me despite everything I did wrong. They're connected because we're connected, and they're different sizes because our relationship will never be perfectly balanced. I'll always owe you more than you owe me." I stared at the necklace, this simple piece of jewelry that somehow captured the complexity of what we'd built together. "There's something else," he said softly, "an inscription." I turned the pendant over and read the tiny engraved words. "For Amber, my daughter, my hero, my second chance. Love, Dad, Dad." He'd written Dad. The word I hadn't been able to say for 13 years. The word that had felt like poison in my mouth, like a betrayal of everything I'd survived. But reading it now, seeing it in his careful handwriting, it didn't hurt anymore. "I know you're not ready to call me that yet," he said quickly, "and I know I haven't earned it back. But I wanted you to know that's how I think of myself now. Not as Richard Morrison, who happens to be your biological father, but as your dad. The man who's supposed to protect you and support you and be proud of you no matter what." I looked up at him. This man who had spent a year proving that people could change, that second chances were sometimes worth the devastating risk. "What if I told you I've been thinking about it?" I said quietly. Hope flickered in his eyes. "About what?" "About calling you Dad again." His breath caught. "Really? Really?" It still feels scary. Like if I say it, I'm giving you the power to hurt me again. But I paused, trying to find the right words. "But I think that's what love is. Giving someone the power to hurt you and trusting them not to use it." "I will never use it," he said fiercely. "I swear to you I will never hurt you again." "I believe you," I said, and realized I meant it. "Dad." The word came out soft, tentative, like a bird taking flight for the first time. But it came out, and the world didn't end. The sky didn't fall. Instead, my father, my dad, started crying. "I've been waiting 13 years to hear you say that word," he whispered. "I've been waiting 13 years to feel safe enough to say it." He pulled me into a hug, and for the first time since I was 15 years old, I let myself relax completely in my father's arms. Let myself be his daughter again, fully and without reservation. "I love you, Amber," he said into my hair. "I have always loved you, even when I was too broken to show it properly. I love you too." "Dad." We stood there in my living room, holding each other and crying, both of us amazed that we'd found our way back to this moment, both of us grateful for Helen's impossible gift, the gift of a second chance we'd almost been too afraid to take. Later that evening, we drove to the cemetery together. It had become our tradition, visiting Mom's grave whenever we had something important to celebrate or process. Today felt like both. "I think she'd be proud of us," I said, kneeling to place fresh flowers by her headstone. "I think she'd be amazed we managed not to kill each other," Richard, Dad, said, making me laugh. She always said we were both too stubborn for our own good. She was right about a lot of things. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the old oak tree. I thought about the scared 15-year-old girl who had knelt here 13 years ago, crying and alone, convinced that no one would ever love her again. I wished I could tell her that she was wrong, that love would find her again in the most unexpected way. "Dad?" I said, testing the word again, liking how it felt on my tongue. "Yes? Thank you for not giving up on us. Even when I wanted to give up on us. Thank you for being brave enough to try again. For being the bigger person when I couldn't be." "We both had to be brave," I said. "That's what made it work." As we walked back to the car, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "How did he react to you calling him Dad?" I smiled and typed back, "He cried. I cried. It was perfect." "I'm so happy for you," she wrote back immediately. Helen would be proud. Helen, the woman who had seen what we couldn't see, who had believed in us when we didn't believe in ourselves, who had used her final act to give us the greatest gift possible, the chance to heal. "You know what I realized today?" I said to Dad as we drove home. "What's that?" Helen's will wasn't really about the money at all. The money was just the excuse to force us together. What she really left me was you, a second chance with my father. And what she really left me was the opportunity to earn back the most important thing I ever lost. "What's that?" "My daughter's love." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You earned it back, Dad. You definitely earned it back." That night, I called Helen's lawyer to officially accept the inheritance. All of it. No conditions, no requirements, no hoops to jump through. Just $12 million and the freedom to do whatever I wanted with it. But the real inheritance, the one that mattered, had nothing to do with money. It was the relationship I'd rebuilt with my father, the trust we'd painstakingly reconstructed, the love we'd found again despite everything that had tried to destroy it. Helen had known exactly what she was doing. She'd known that we needed each other, that forgiveness was possible, That love could survive even the worst betrayals if both people were willing to do the work. She'd known that sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be bought. They have to be earned, one difficult conversation at a time, one act of trust at a time, one "I love you" at a time, and she'd been right. The girl who had once been thrown away like garbage was now a woman who knew she was cherished. The man who had once been too broken to love properly had learned to be the father he'd always meant to be. We'd found our way back to each other. Against all odds, despite all the pain, we'd found our way home,